Hi, it's Dr. Z. In this section, I will be defining psychological disorders. By the end of this video, you'll be able to define abnormal behavior, explain how different theoretical approaches view the causes of psychological disorders, and how we classify and diagnose disorders using the DSM-5. Please feel free to pause the video at any time to take notes. In Jumpstart question number 1, I asked, what was considered abnormal behavior? Most students come up with examples such as hearing voices or talking to yourself. Psychologists believe that behavior lies on a continuum, from well-adjusted on one end to maladaptive on the other end. If we break down the word maladaptive, the prefix mal refers to bad or poor, and adaptive refers to a behavior that should adapt. In other words, maladaptive refers to behavior that's poorly suited to a particular situation or function. Now, think back to the examples you came up with for abnormal behavior. Which ones would you place under well-adjusted? Which ones would you maybe place under maladaptive? Can you come up with scenarios in which any of your examples of, quote, abnormal behavior may actually be considered well-adjusted? I bet we could all find scenarios in which hearing voices or talking to yourself may be considered well-adjusted behavior. In this course, my goal has been for you to start thinking like a psychologist. When a psychologist is working with a client, we need to ask a variety of questions to learn more about the situation and how we can best help our client. There are 6 key questions to ask that help us determine if the client is exhibiting abnormal behavior. The first characteristic of abnormal behavior is deviant. Deviant refers to a behavior that is atypical or extremely unusual. 2 questions we will ask are, is the behavior considered strange within the person's culture? What is considered abnormal in one culture is not necessarily considered so in another. The second question is, is behavior unusual for those at the same age? Many behaviors that are considered normal at one age are not considered so in other periods of life. The second characteristic of abnormal behavior is maladaptive. 2 questions we will ask are, to what degree is behavior maladaptive? This question assesses the extent to which the behavior impairs an individual's functioning. The second question, is the person a danger to self or to others? Psychologists have a duty to protect their client and those who may be placed in danger as a result of a client's actions. Here is where we would assess for suicide. The third characteristic of abnormal behavior is personally distressful. 2 questions we will ask are, does the behavior cause personal distress? We may all experience anxiety at times, but does it cause us such personal distress to the point where it impacts our ability to go to work or go to school? The second question, is the person legally responsible for his or her acts? The term insanity is only used by the legal system. Mental health professionals do not use this term. It is the legal term used by courts to declare people not legally responsible for their acts. Psychological disorders come in many different shapes and sizes and shades, just like this colorful photo of buttons. Let's discuss some interesting facts about psychological disorders. Did you know that psychological disorders have a lifetime prevalence rate of nearly 50%? Think about it from this perspective. If your group or table has 4 people, then this means that 2 people at each table has had, currently has, or will have a psychological disorder in their lifetime. In essence, 50% of the class may be afflicted with a psychological disorder over the course of their life. Surprising, isn't it? Did you know that psychological disorders are more common than cancer? Less than 1% of people are newly diagnosed with cancer each year, whereas 26% of individuals are diagnosed with a mental disorder of some kind. So, what is the definition of a psychological disorder? Well, psychology studies how we think and behave. Thus, psychological disorders involve mental processes and/or behavior patterns that cause emotional distress and/or a substantial impairment in function. The two key parts of this definition are in bold: emotional distress and impairment in functioning. For example, have you ever been anxious? Did being anxious cause you so much personal distress that you could not function? Could you not get out of bed in the morning? Could you not go to school and complete assignments? Or could you not go to work? That is an example of an impairment in functioning. Now, what can cause a person to develop a psychological disorder? Like this palette of paints here, there are different theoretical approaches that can explain the underlying causes of disorders. The biological approach believes that psychological disorders have organic, internal causes. In other words, the brain, genetic factors, and neurochemical influences may play a role. The psychological approach focuses on how thoughts, emotions, and behaviors contribute to psychological disorders. In other words, this approach takes into account the psychodynamic, behavioral, humanistic, and cognitive perspectives of psychology. Sociocultural approach acknowledges the role of the social environment and culture in the development of psychological disorders. And finally, the biopsychosocial approach is well-rounded, or a holistic view that psychological disorders arise from multiple factors, such as biological, psychological, and social. The vulnerability stress hypothesis explains that pre-existing conditions may place an individual at risk for developing a psychological disorder. So, how do we know if someone has a psychological disorder? Psychiatrists and psychologists have created systems to classify and diagnose psychological disorders. Mental health professionals use a manual that describes and classifies psychological disorders. It is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. It's a mouthful, so we refer to it as the DSM for short. Its purpose is to classify over 300 psychological disorders, and it lists criteria to make diagnosis. There's no way that anyone can memorize 300 disorders and their symptoms. That's why we have the DSM-5. A fun fact about the DSM-5, it is published by the American Psychiatric Association, not the American Psychological Association. Now, there are some important notes to discuss regarding psychological disorders and mental health. There are some common terms that students should learn and understand about psychological disorders. Comorbidity sounds scary, but it's not. The prefix co means two, and morbidity is just technical language for the rate of a disease in a population. In other words, comorbidity means that an individual has two or more disorders at the same time. More often than not, someone diagnosed with an anxiety disorder may also have depression. Etiology is just a fancy word for the cause or source of a psychological disorder. For most disorders, there's not just one cause. Risk factors are characteristics, experiences, even exposure that increase the likelihood of a person developing a disorder. Now, I do have a final word of caution. Once students learn about psychological disorders, it's very common to then start diagnosing everyone and anyone, including yourself, with a disorder. So please leave diagnosis of psychological disorders to trained professionals. In summary, psychological disorders involve understanding what is considered abnormal behavior, learning different theoretical approaches, and how psychologists diagnose the wide variety of disorders that exist. Understanding psychological disorders is the first step in helping individuals who are experiencing emotional distress and a substantial impairment in functioning.